When we die, people will gather to talk about us and our lives. What will they say about me? What will they say about you? I recently heard a story about three men who gathered at the funeral of one of their acquaintances, where they heard a beautiful sermon. At the reception after this funeral, these three men began discussing this exact question: what they hoped would be said at their funerals. The first man said, "I hope the priest gets up in the pulpit and he talks about how I was a great physician, about how many lives I saved, how many people I cured." The second man nodded, and then he said, "I hope the priest gets up in the pulpit and he looks down at the congregation and talks about how I was a great husband and a great father, how I was present with my family." And all three men nodded. And then the third man said, "When the priest climbs up in the pulpit at my funeral and looks down at the open casket, I hope he says, 'Look, he's moving!'" What do you want people to say about you after you're gone? In the gospel passage we read a moment ago, Jesus told a parable about two men. First, an unnamed rich man who lived a life of luxury and cold-hearted indifference towards the poor. Second, a poor man named Lazarus who sat at the gate of this rich man's house begging. And although he was starving, it seemed like he may have even had compassion towards the stray dogs that gathered around him. When the two men died, the rich man found himself in Hades, a nice word for hell, and the poor man found himself in the presence of Abraham, in other words, in heaven. This passage could lead us to speculate about how we get into heaven, and it may sound like the message of this passage is if we're good people, we'll get enough frequent flyer points that we'll win a free trip to heaven. But that's not really how the Bible describes this sorting between heaven and hell. Instead, this parable is a reminder that while we are invited into heaven by God's grace and God's boundless love, nonetheless, the decisions we make now will have ramifications, and in many cases, ramifications that will echo even beyond our lives. I had a grandmother who was larger than life. Her name was Hester, a good name for her generation, but she was a rabid football fan. And when she was in maybe her 30s or early 40s, she was leaving a game that her home team had just won, and someone shouted to her across the parking lot, "Good game, Tiger!" She liked that so much that she went home that afternoon and called all her children and instructed them that she was to be known as Tiger from that day on. Tiger was bigger than life. For decades, she would volunteer 3 times a week at the hospital a couple blocks from her house, where she served as a volunteer receptionist. She gave financially to countless organizations in her community. And as you can probably guess based off her nickname, Tiger wasn't one of those tender, loving grandmothers who'd kind of sit a grandchild on her knee and then go cook a pie in the kitchen. But nonetheless, if something was wrong in my life, if something was bothering me, Tiger would work to listen and empathize with me and then reassure me that I was loved. Tiger died 20 years ago, but I still talk about her probably every week, and I still think about her every day. Tiger had a huge impact. What about you? How will people remember you? What will people say about you? Do you want people to talk about your generosity? How you gave hours serving at a local hospital? Or how you gave hours serving at the cathedral bookstore? You want people to talk about how you had such a deep faith that you help inspire others. My point is that it's God's grace that gets us into heaven, but you have the power to help choose your legacy, to help choose how you'll be remembered. There's a couple who I remember fondly from when I was growing up at the cathedral. Even when I was 10, 12, 13 years old, I remember the love and kindness this couple showed. And when they died, they left their house to the cathedral. Their house was eventually sold, and my office now sits in a building that was bought in part with the proceeds from that house. Helen and Brooks Brown were a couple that chose the legacy they would leave. And even if no one knew what they did, even if no one ever talked about what they did, they made a lasting impact on their community, on this church. Our Old Testament passage today is about the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesied, he warned King Zedekiah, the king of Judah, that if he continued to be unfaithful to God, Jerusalem would be destroyed. Zedekiah was infuriated, so he threw Jeremiah into a prison in the middle of Jerusalem. And guess what happened next? The Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, laying siege to the entire city. Amidst this siege, one of Jeremiah's cousins, Hanamel, snuck through the siege lines and came to visit Jeremiah in prison. It turns out that Hanamel's father, Jeremiah's uncle, had somehow lost his home, and he wanted Jeremiah to buy it through a legal process known as redemption. Now, I'm going to spend a minute explaining some historic Jewish customs and practices, but this leads to a point, so trust me, stick with me for a minute here. Essentially, Hebrew law said that if your home was foreclosed on, your closest relatives had first right of refusal to buy this land before it was listed for public auction. And here's the important geographical detail for our story today. Jeremiah's home was in the town of Anathoth, and this town, even to this day, stands only 3 miles from Jerusalem. In other words, this house was sitting on land that was almost certainly occupied by the invading Babylonian army. So I want you to understand this situation with me. Imagine that this cathedral is Jerusalem, and we're surrounded by an invading and attacking Babylonian army. How valuable is the title to a house 3 miles away in San Marco? It's probably worth nothing. But God told Jeremiah to buy this land. There's almost no conceivable way that Jeremiah would ever benefit from this purchase. He was locked in prison, he was in a city under siege, and the property he was buying was controlled by an enemy army. However, it was possible that his cousin or his uncle or someone else in his family would one day be able to live on this land again if Jeremiah redeemed it. This passage describes Jeremiah paying 17 shekels of silver and bringing witnesses into his prison cell and signing a deed and carefully folding it and placing it in a special earthenware jar. This whole series of events is essentially what we do today when we go to a title and closing company when we're buying our houses. Jeremiah was choosing his legacy. And frankly, as we're in the midst of a stewardship campaign here at the cathedral, that's what we're invited to do also. We're invited to think about investing in something larger than ourselves. We're invited to help invest so that we can spread God's love more broadly and more powerfully and to more people. We're invited to invest in the future of the cathedral. We're invited to choose our legacies. In 1866, Ludwig Nobel, the brother of Alfred Nobel, died. A local newspaper made an error confusing the two brothers and mistakenly ran an obituary for Alfred Nobel, who was still alive, explaining that this tycoon who had accumulated insurmountable wealth, who had companies in 20 countries, explaining that he would most be remembered for his creation of dynamite, which was described as the most heinous and destructive item ever made by humanity. After Alfred Nobel read his own obituary plastered across the front page of the paper, he decided he wanted to rewrite his legacy. So Alfred Nobel sat down and rewrote his will. And when Alfred Nobel actually died on December 10th, 1896, it was revealed that his vast wealth was going to be used to fund 5 prizes, the most notable of which may be the Nobel Peace Prize. Just before Alfred Nobel's death, he confided in a friend, "I want to be remembered for peace, not destruction." Alfred Nobel chose his legacy. And that's the invitation that we have also. We can think about our call to invest our financial resources in something larger than ourselves, especially thinking about our call to our church during this stewardship season. We can listen to the parable of Jesus and realize that we can choose our legacy. We can look to the example of Alfred Nobel and realize that it's not too late to rewrite our own obituaries. We can learn from the model of Jeremiah and invest our resources in endeavors that won't benefit primarily ourselves, but will benefit others. So the question that we face is, how will we respond? Or to say this another way, after you die, what do you want people to say about you? Amen.